The morning sun of June 4, 1942, cast long shadows across the flight deck of the USS Enterprise as Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey gripped the controls of his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath him, a vast blue desert where death waited in every direction. His fuel gauge showed dangerously low levels, and standard Navy protocol demanded an immediate return to base. But McCluskey had a choice that would echo through history. He could follow orders and turn back, abandoning the most crucial search mission of the Pacific War, or he could push forward into the unknown, risking the lives of 32 airmen under his command. The metallic taste of fear filled his mouth as he keyed his radio microphone. Around him, the drone of Wright Cyclone engines filled the air with mechanical thunder, while below, somewhere in that endless expanse of water, the fate of America hung in the balance. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with salt spray created an intoxicating cocktail of danger and purpose. His heart hammered against his ribs as he made a decision that would either be remembered as brilliant heroism or catastrophic insubordination. The radio crackled with static and fragmentary reports of disaster from other American units, painting a picture of mounting chaos and defeat. His squadron of dive bombers represented one of the last intact American striking forces in the entire Pacific Fleet, and their loss would effectively end any hope of victory in the most important naval battle of the 20th century. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like the Pacific sky itself, heavy with the knowledge that his next decision would determine whether America continued to fight or began the long retreat toward inevitable surrender. No one in the Pacific Fleet knew that one pilot's defiance that morning would rewrite the entire course of World War II and transform the balance of power in the Pacific, from hopeless defeat to stunning victory. Wade McCluskey had not been born for glory. In the small farming community of Buffalo, New York, he grew up as the son of a modest railroad worker named Francis McCluskey, who believed in hard work, integrity, and doing what was right, regardless of the consequences. His childhood was marked not by privilege, but by the steady rhythm of honest labor and the quiet dignity of working-class America during the early decades of the 20th century. The McCluskey household was one where character mattered more than wealth, where a man's word was his bond, and where sacrifice for others was considered not heroic but simply the natural order of things. When the Great Depression struck with devastating force in 1929, young Wade watched his father lose his job with the New York Central Railroad, yet never lose his principles or his determination to provide for his family. It was during these formative years of economic hardship that McCluskey developed the stubborn independence and moral compass that would later define his military career and ultimately save American forces at Midway. His father's example taught him that sometimes a man must make difficult choices without the luxury of perfect information, and that the consequences of inaction could be far worse than the risks of decisive action. The lessons learned during those lean years included the importance of careful planning, resourcefulness in the face of adversity, and the willingness to take calculated risks when conventional approaches failed to achieve necessary results. His mother, Margaret McCluskey, was a school teacher who instilled in her son a love of learning and an analytical approach to problem-solving that would later prove invaluable in the complex tactical situations of naval aviation. She taught him to question assumptions, think independently, and trust his judgment even when others disagreed with his conclusions. His path to the Navy began not through family tradition or romantic notions of maritime adventure, but through a pragmatic desire for education and opportunity that his family could never afford during the economic devastation of the Depression era. The Naval Academy at Annapolis represented escape from the economic hardship that had defined his youth, but it also demanded a level of discipline and conformity that chafed against his naturally independent spirit and analytical mind. During his years as a midshipman from 1929 to 1933, McCluskey earned a reputation as a competent but unconventional officer candidate who questioned orders when they seemed illogical and who possessed an almost supernatural ability to navigate by instinct when instruments failed or when standard procedures proved inadequate for the situation at hand. His academic performance was solid but not spectacular, ranking in the middle of his class in most subjects, except navigation and seamanship, where his intuitive understanding of wind, current, and compass variation consistently placed him at the top of his class. His flight training at Pensacola revealed a pilot with exceptional natural skills, but a troubling tendency to improvise when standard procedures proved inadequate for achieving mission objectives. Flight instructors noted in their reports that McCluskey possessed an unusual ability to find targets when others returned empty-handed, but they also documented his habit of extending missions beyond prescribed parameters when he believed the tactical situation demanded aggressive action rather than strict adherence to conservative operational procedures. This pattern of principled disobedience would follow him throughout his early naval career, earning him both admirers and critics within the rigid hierarchy of military command structure that valued conformity and predictability above individual initiative and tactical innovation. His superiors recognized his exceptional navigational skills and aggressive leadership style, but they worried about his tendency to interpret orders liberally when he believed mission success required deviation from standard operating procedures. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between victory and the potential collapse of American resistance in the Pacific theater of operations. By the spring of 1942, the strategic situation in the Pacific had deteriorated to a point where American naval commanders faced impossible choices with inadequate resources and overwhelming enemy superiority in every measurable category. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had decimated the Pacific Fleet, sinking or severely damaging 18 warships, including 8 battleships, destroying 188 aircraft, and killing over 2,400 American servicemen in a single morning that transformed the United States from a neutral observer to an active participant in the global conflict. The attack left only 3 aircraft carriers operational in the Pacific: Enterprise, Hornet, and the heavily damaged Yorktown, which had been rushed back into service despite requiring months of additional repair work. These 3 ships represented the entire striking power of the United States Navy in the Pacific, facing the seemingly invincible Imperial Japanese Navy, which had swept across the Pacific with unprecedented speed and coordination in a campaign that demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of carrier-based aviation when properly employed in coordinated operations. The Japanese had conquered the Philippines, trapping General Douglas MacArthur's forces on the Bataan Peninsula and forcing the eventual surrender of over 75,000 American and Filipino troops in the largest capitulation in United States military history. The Dutch East Indies had fallen after a brief but decisive campaign that secured Japan's access to the oil resources essential for continued military operations. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress that controlled the sea lanes to India and Australia, had surrendered after a campaign that exposed the fundamental weakness of fixed fortifications against modern combined arms warfare. Wake Island, defended by fewer than 400 Marines, had held out for 2 weeks against overwhelming Japanese assault forces before finally succumbing to superior numbers and firepower. The speed of Japanese conquest had shattered every preconceived notion about the balance of power in the Pacific and left American strategists scrambling to develop defensive plans with wholly inadequate resources. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, knew from intercepted communications that Japan was planning a massive offensive operation somewhere in the Central Pacific, but intelligence reports remained fragmentary and contradictory until the very eve of battle. The Japanese had demonstrated their ability to coordinate complex operations across thousands of miles of ocean, striking multiple targets simultaneously with precision timing that overwhelmed defensive preparations. American forces had been reduced to a series of desperate holding actions, trying to delay Japanese advances, while industrial mobilization slowly began to replace the ships and aircraft lost in the opening months of the war. The strategic reality was brutally simple. If Japan succeeded in destroying the remaining American carrier force, the western coast of the United States would lie open to invasion, Australia would be cut off from American support, and the war in Europe would become academic as America fought for survival on its own shores. Codebreakers at Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had intercepted Japanese communications indicating a major operation against a target designated as AF. But confirmation that this referred to Midway Atoll came only through an ingenious deception operation that revealed Japanese intentions just days before the attack was scheduled to begin. The intelligence breakthrough provided American commanders with the precious gift of advance warning. But it also revealed the enormous scale of the Japanese operation and the hopeless odds facing American defensive forces. Midway itself was a tiny speck of coral and sand in the vast Pacific, strategically important only because it provided an advanced base for American reconnaissance aircraft and served as an early warning station for Hawaii, located 1,100 miles to the southeast. The atoll consisted of 2 small islands with a total land area of less than 3 square miles, defended by fewer than 3,000 Marines and sailors equipped with obsolete aircraft and inadequate fortifications that had been designed for a different kind of warfare. Against this modest force, Admiral Yamamoto was deploying the largest naval armada in Japanese history, including 4 heavy aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 2 light carriers, 7 battleships, 15 cruisers, and 42 destroyers, supported by transport vessels carrying 5,000 invasion troops and the equipment necessary to establish a permanent Japanese base within striking distance of Hawaii. The mathematical reality was starkly simple. American forces were outnumbered in every category except courage and desperation, facing an enemy force that represented the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled in the Pacific Ocean. The plan developed by American commanders was born of necessity rather than confidence, relying on surprise, timing, and the hope that Japanese overconfidence might create opportunities for tactical success against impossible odds. Admiral Nimitz had assembled every available ship and aircraft in the Pacific Fleet for the defense of Midway, but the forces at his disposal remained pitifully inadequate compared to the Japanese armada approaching from the northwest. The strategy required precise coordination between land-based aircraft on Midway, submarine patrols positioned along Japanese approach routes, and the 3 aircraft carriers that represented America's last hope for offensive action in the Pacific. The carriers would approach from the northeast, positioning themselves to strike the Japanese fleet when it was most vulnerable during the attack on Midway itself. The plan assumed that Japanese carriers would be caught with their aircraft on deck, either launching strikes against Midway or recovering aircraft returning from previous attacks. Success required perfect timing, flawless execution, and a degree of luck that seemed impossible given the string of disasters that had characterized American operations since Pearl Harbor. The submarine component of the operation had already begun to show ominous signs of failure, as most of the boats positioned along Japanese approach routes had been detected and driven off by superior Japanese anti-submarine forces. Land-based aircraft on Midway, including obsolete Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters and antiquated B-26 Marauder bombers, faced the impossible task of inflicting significant damage on Japanese forces while defending the atoll against overwhelming aerial assault. The carrier forces represented the only realistic hope for achieving decisive results, but they would be operating at extreme range with minimal fighter cover and no possibility of reinforcement if the initial attack failed. The entire operation represented a gamble of unprecedented proportions, risking the complete destruction of American naval power in the Pacific on the slim chance that superior tactics and desperate courage might overcome impossible odds. Intelligence estimates suggested that the Japanese attack on Midway would begin at dawn on June 4th, providing a narrow window of opportunity for American forces to achieve surprise before Japanese defensive preparations could be completed. The success of the operation depended entirely on finding the Japanese carriers at the moment of maximum vulnerability and delivering coordinated attacks that would overwhelm their defensive capabilities before they could launch counterstrikes against the American fleet. The morning of June 4th began with ominous signs that suggested the carefully laid American plans were already beginning to unravel in ways that threatened to transform a desperate gamble into a catastrophic defeat. At 4:30 in the morning, a PBY Catalina flying boat piloted by Lieutenant Howard 80 spotted the approaching Japanese fleet approximately 700 miles northwest of Midway, but the sighting report was delayed by communication failures that would plague American operations throughout the day and create dangerous gaps in tactical coordination. The massive Japanese formation included the 4 heavy carriers arranged in a defensive box formation, supported by battleships and cruisers that bristled with anti-aircraft weapons designed to repel exactly the kind of attack American forces were attempting to execute. The first wave of Japanese aircraft, 108 Nakajima B-5N Kate bombers and 0 fighters under the command of Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata, struck Midway at 6:20 in the morning, encountering fierce but ultimately ineffective resistance from the Marine defenders who fought with obsolete equipment against superior numbers and modern aircraft. The antiquated Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters defending the atoll were systematically destroyed by the superior Japanese Zero fighters, which demonstrated technological and tactical advantages that American pilots had not anticipated. Major Floyd Parks led 25 Marine fighters into combat against the Japanese formation, but only 10 aircraft survived the encounter, with Parks himself among the casualties. The bombing attack severely damaged the airfield facilities, fuel storage areas, and defensive installations, but failed to completely neutralize Midway as a base for American operations. American bomber crews on Midway launched desperate attacks against the Japanese fleet, but their obsolete aircraft and inadequate training resulted in no hits and heavy casualties among the attacking force that further reduced American striking power. 4 Army B-26 Marauder bombers attempted a low-level torpedo attack against Japanese carriers, but anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception destroyed 2 aircraft while the survivors achieved no hits on their targets. 6 Navy TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, flying their first combat mission, attacked the Japanese carriers but were intercepted by Zero fighters that shot down 5 of the 6 aircraft before they could reach their targets. The sole surviving Avenger, piloted by Ensign Albert Ernest, managed to return to Midway despite severe battle damage that left his gunner dead and his aircraft barely capable of controlled flight. Meanwhile, the 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, maneuvered northeast of Midway under the command of Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance and Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, attempting to position themselves for a coordinated strike against the Japanese carriers while remaining beyond the range of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. The tactical situation was complicated by communication problems that prevented effective coordination between the carrier forces and created dangerous delays in the planned attacks. The morning hours brought a series of communication failures, mistimed attacks, and tactical miscalculations that suggested American forces were heading toward a catastrophic defeat that would end any hope of continued resistance in the Pacific. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, found the Japanese carriers first but was virtually annihilated by Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire in an attack that demonstrated the futility of unescorted torpedo bombing against modern fleet defenses. Only Ensign George Gay survived the attack, floating in the ocean where he witnessed the destruction of his entire squadron while hiding beneath a seat cushion that concealed him from Japanese aircraft. The heroic sacrifice of these airmen served a crucial tactical purpose by drawing Japanese fighter coverage down to sea level and exhausting ammunition that would otherwise be available for defending against subsequent attacks. But their loss represented a devastating blow to American strike capability that could not be easily replaced. Similar fates befell the torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown, as Torpedo Squadron 6 lost 10 of 14 aircraft while achieving no hits on enemy targets, and Torpedo Squadron 3 lost 12 of 13 aircraft in equally futile attacks against the Japanese carriers. The mathematics of the battle were becoming grimly clear. American forces were losing aircraft and trained aircrew at an unsustainable rate, while the Japanese carriers remained unscathed and capable of launching additional strikes against both Midway and the American fleet that would complete the destruction of American naval power in the Pacific. It was against this backdrop of mounting disaster that Wade McCluskey faced the most important decision of his military career, a choice that would determine not only the fate of his squadron, but the entire course of the Pacific War. As commander of Enterprise Air Group, he was leading 32 SBD Dauntless dive bombers in search of the Japanese carriers, but mechanical failures and navigation errors had already consumed precious fuel that left his formation with barely enough range to return safely to Enterprise. The original flight plan, developed based on intelligence estimates of Japanese fleet position and course, called for a direct approach to the estimated position of the Japanese carriers. But when McCluskey arrived at the designated coordinates at the prescribed time, he found only empty ocean stretching to the horizon in every direction. Standard operating procedure, drilled into every naval aviator during training, dictated an immediate return to Enterprise, as continuing the search would risk losing the entire squadron to fuel exhaustion in a futile attempt to find an enemy that might have already escaped or changed course. His fellow pilots were already expressing concern over their fuel status through hand signals and abbreviated radio transmissions, as strict radio silence was maintained to prevent Japanese forces from detecting American aircraft through electronic intercepts. Several aircraft were showing signs of mechanical problems that would worsen with extended flight time, including rough-running engines and hydraulic leaks that threatened to disable critical flight controls. The radio occasionally crackled with fragmentary reports from other American units, painting a picture of confusion and mounting losses that suggested the battle was slipping away from American control despite all the careful planning and desperate hopes invested in the operation. McCluskey understood with grim clarity that his dive bombers represented one of the last intact American striking forces remaining in the battle, and their loss would effectively end American offensive capability against the Japanese fleet. But he also recognized that returning to Enterprise without attacking the Japanese carriers would condemn American forces to a purely defensive battle they could not win, as Japanese air superiority would enable systematic destruction of remaining American ships and installations. His navigational instincts, honed through years of flying over the Pacific in all weather conditions and at all hours of the day and night, suggested that the Japanese fleet had altered course since the morning sighting reports, probably in response to the American attacks that had been launched from Midway throughout the early morning hours. He believed he could find them by following a logical search pattern based on tactical necessity rather than intelligence estimates that might be hours out of date. The decision required him to ignore explicit orders about fuel conservation and risk assessment, gambling the lives of his pilots and the future of American resistance against the possibility of delivering a decisive blow against the Japanese fleet. His wingman, Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson, later recalled the moment when McCluskey's voice came over the radio with quiet determination that masked the enormous weight of responsibility he was accepting. "We're going to keep looking." The simple announcement sent a chill through the formation, as every pilot understood the implications of continuing the search with fuel gauges already approaching the point of no return. They knew that McCluskey was betting their lives on his navigational judgment and his understanding of Japanese tactical doctrine, trusting that his analysis of the situation was more accurate than the intelligence estimates that had guided their original flight plan. The search that followed tested every skill McCluskey had developed during his naval career, as he led his formation through a complex pattern designed to cover the maximum area of ocean with minimum fuel expenditure while maintaining the formation integrity necessary for an effective attack. His decision was based on a careful analysis of Japanese tactical doctrine and the logical requirements of their mission, rather than blind hope or reckless courage that ignored the mathematical realities of fuel consumption and range limitations. He reasoned that if the Japanese carriers had launched a second strike against Midway, as radio reports suggested they had, they would have turned northeast to close the distance and reduce flight time for their returning aircraft. This course change would explain why the American attack groups had found empty ocean at the original intercept coordinates, as the Japanese fleet had moved beyond the search area while American aircraft were en route to the original target position. McCluskey adjusted his search pattern accordingly, leading his formation on a northwesterly heading that would intersect the probable Japanese position if his analysis proved correct. The gamble required precise fuel management and perfect timing, as any delay or deviation from the most efficient flight path would leave his aircraft without sufficient fuel to return to Enterprise. The psychological pressure on the formation was enormous, as pilots watched their fuel gauges drop toward empty while scanning the endless expanse of blue water for any sign of the enemy fleet that might not even exist in the search area. The Pacific Ocean stretched in every direction without a single landmark or reference point, creating a sense of isolation and vulnerability that tested the nerves of even experienced combat pilots. Radio discipline remained strict, but McCluskey could sense the growing tension in his formation as aircraft began showing signs of fuel starvation and mechanical problems. Several pilots signaled their fuel concerns through hand gestures, but McCluskey continued the search with grim determination, knowing that turning back would abandon their only chance to strike a decisive blow against the Japanese fleet. The weight of command pressed down on him with crushing intensity as he bore sole responsibility for decisions that would determine whether his pilots lived or died, and whether America continued to resist or began the long retreat toward defeat. At 9:55 in the morning, more than 3 hours after takeoff and with fuel gauges showing dangerously low levels throughout the formation, McCluskey spotted a thin white line on the ocean surface that his experienced eye immediately recognized as the wake of a high-speed warship steaming at flank speed through the Pacific swells. Following the wake northward with mounting excitement and relief, he soon saw what every American pilot had been praying to find throughout the long morning of fruitless searching. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers arranged in a defensive box formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed for the next strike against American forces. The sight that greeted McCluskey was both an opportunity and a revelation, as the Japanese carriers were caught in their most vulnerable moment, with fuel lines exposed on their hangar decks and ammunition scattered around aircraft that were being prepared for immediate launch. The tactical situation was perfect for a dive bomber attack, presenting clear targets with minimal defensive fighter coverage at the precise moment when secondary explosions would cause maximum damage to enemy capabilities. But this opportunity existed only because McCluskey had chosen to ignore his orders and extend his search beyond safe operational limits, gambling everything on his navigational judgment and his understanding of Japanese tactical doctrine. The dive bomber attack that followed was a masterpiece of tactical coordination and individual courage, as McCluskey's squadron executed a near-perfect assault against the Japanese carrier Kaga while simultaneously coordinating with dive bombers from Yorktown, attacking the carriers Soryu and Akagi in a convergent assault that overwhelmed Japanese defensive capabilities. The attack began at 10:22 in the morning, when McCluskey rolled his Dauntless into a 70-degree dive from 14,000 feet, leading his squadron down through intense anti-aircraft fire toward the crowded flight deck of Kaga, which was in the process of launching a strike against the American fleet with aircraft spotted on deck and fuel lines connected for final preparation. The carrier's defensive anti-aircraft fire created a deadly curtain of exploding shells and machine gun tracers, but the dive-bombing attack came from such a steep angle that Japanese gunners found it difficult to track the American aircraft as they plunged toward their targets at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour. McCluskey's bomb, a 1,000-pound armor-piercing weapon designed to penetrate heavily armored targets, struck the carrier near the island superstructure and penetrated through the flight deck to the hangar deck before exploding among stored aircraft and ordnance in a massive fireball that immediately set off secondary explosions throughout the ship. The blast ignited aviation fuel that had been pumped into aircraft on the hangar deck, creating an inferno that spread rapidly through the ship's interior spaces and made firefighting efforts impossible. Additional bombs from McCluskey's squadron struck along the length of Kaga's flight deck, destroying aircraft and creating fires that merged into a single conflagration that consumed the entire forward section of the carrier. The secondary explosions that followed created a cascading series of fires and detonations that quickly spread throughout the ship, turning the once proud carrier that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor into a floating inferno that lit up the morning sky with towering columns of black smoke visible for dozens of miles across the Pacific. The attack was perfectly timed to coincide with similar assaults on carriers Akagi and Soryu by dive bombers from other American squadrons, creating a coordinated blow that destroyed 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers within the span of 5 miraculous minutes that transformed the entire strategic balance of the Pacific War. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading a 3-plane section of Enterprise dive bombers in an attack on Akagi, delivered the fatal blow to the flagship of the Japanese carrier force with a perfectly placed bomb that penetrated to the hangar deck and ignited stored ordnance in an explosion that immediately doomed the carrier. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led dive bombers from Yorktown in a simultaneous attack on Soryu that achieved similar devastating results, as American bombs found their targets with unprecedented accuracy during those crucial minutes when Japanese defensive attention was divided between multiple attacking formations. The carrier Soryu fell victim to 3 direct hits that ignited fires on both the flight deck and hangar deck, creating conditions that made the ship uninhabitable within minutes of the attack. The tactical success of the coordinated assault was unprecedented in naval aviation history, as American dive bomber crews achieved a hit percentage that exceeded all previous training results and demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of properly coordinated attacks against enemy capital ships. The psychological impact on Japanese crews was equally devastating, as the carriers that had spearheaded the attack on Pearl Harbor and had seemed invincible throughout 6 months of uninterrupted victory were reduced to burning wrecks within minutes of the American assault. Eyewitness accounts from Japanese survivors described scenes of chaos and horror as fires spread through the ships faster than damage control parties could respond, trapping hundreds of sailors below decks and forcing the abandonment of vessels that had been considered the most powerful warships in the world. The mathematical transformation of the battle was immediate and decisive. In 5 minutes, the balance of naval aviation power in the Pacific had shifted from overwhelming Japanese superiority to rough parity between the opposing forces, creating opportunities for American victory that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. The immediate aftermath of McCluskey's successful attack created a series of consequences that extended far beyond the tactical situation at Midway, transforming the entire strategic balance of the Pacific War and beginning the long American offensive that would eventually culminate in Japan's surrender. His decision to ignore fuel limitations and continue searching for the Japanese fleet had enabled the destruction of 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, but it also left his formation dangerously low on fuel for the return flight to Enterprise, creating a new crisis that threatened to diminish the victory through the loss of irreplaceable pilots and aircraft. Several aircraft were forced to ditch in the ocean when their engines quit from fuel exhaustion during the return flight, but the majority of McCluskey's pilots managed to reach their carrier and execute successful landings, despite fuel tanks that registered empty. The rescue of ditched aircrew became a priority operation for American ships in the area, as these experienced pilots represented invaluable assets that could not be easily replaced. The Japanese response was swift and desperate, as Admiral Nagumo ordered the surviving carrier Hiryu to launch 2 successive strikes against the American fleet in a final attempt to salvage victory from the disaster that had befallen his force. The first attack, consisting of 18 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters, found and attacked the carrier Yorktown, scoring 3 bomb hits that caused severe damage but did not immediately sink the ship. The second attack, launched by 10 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers with an escort of 6 Zeros, achieved 2 torpedo hits that doomed Yorktown and forced her abandonment, though the carrier remained afloat for 2 additional days before finally sinking. However, the Japanese fleet was no longer capable of sustaining major operations against American forces, having lost 3/4 of its carrier strength and hundreds of trained aircrew who represented years of training and combat experience that could not be quickly replaced. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato, was forced to order a general retreat when reports reached him of the catastrophic losses suffered by the carrier striking force. The planned invasion of Midway was abandoned, along with the broader strategic offensive that was intended to force America into a negotiated peace settlement. The retreat marked the end of Japanese expansion in the Central Pacific and the beginning of a defensive strategy that would prove inadequate against the growing strength of American industrial production and military capability. The strategic implications of the battle were immediately apparent to both sides, as Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, including the veteran ships that had formed the backbone of the force that attacked Pearl Harbor, along with hundreds of trained air crew whose loss crippled Japanese naval aviation capabilities for the remainder of the war. American intelligence analysts quickly recognized that McCluskey's decision had been the crucial factor in achieving tactical surprise, as his extended search had found the Japanese carriers at the precise moment when they were most vulnerable to air attack. The victory at Midway provided the strategic foundation for subsequent American offensive operations in the Pacific, leading directly to the invasion of Guadalcanal 3 months later, and beginning the island-hopping campaign that would bring American forces steadily closer to the Japanese home islands. The long-term consequences of McCluskey's heroic decision extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory at Midway, fundamentally reshaping American naval doctrine and demonstrating the critical value of aggressive leadership and tactical innovation in rapidly changing combat situations. His willingness to risk his squadron in an extended search that violated standard fuel conservation procedures became a case study in naval aviation schools throughout the remainder of the war. Illustrating the importance of tactical flexibility and individual initiative when rigid adherence to established procedures would result in mission failure. The battle itself became a turning point in American morale and strategic planning, proving conclusively that Japanese forces could be defeated by superior tactics and courageous leadership even when facing overwhelming numerical and technological advantages. The victory provided a much-needed boost to American public morale after months of unrelieved disasters in the Pacific, and it demonstrated to allies and enemies alike that American forces remained capable of offensive action despite the devastating losses suffered since Pearl Harbor. McCluskey's post-war career was marked by quiet professionalism and continued service to his country, but he rarely spoke publicly about his role in the battle that had changed the course of history, preferring to credit the courage of his pilots and the effectiveness of their training rather than his own decision-making during the critical moments of the search. Letters and memoirs from surviving pilots in his squadron revealed the deep respect and admiration they felt for a commander who had risked everything on a calculated gamble that saved not only their lives, but the future of their nation's resistance against totalitarian aggression. The tactical innovations demonstrated at Midway, particularly the importance of coordinated dive bomber attacks against enemy carriers, and the value of aggressive search procedures when intelligence proved inadequate, became standard doctrine for American naval aviation throughout the remainder of the war. Japanese naval strategists conducting post-war analysis acknowledged that the loss of experienced carrier aircrew at Midway was more devastating to their long-term capabilities than the destruction of the ships themselves, as these trained pilots represented an irreplaceable resource that required years to develop and could not be quickly restored through industrial production. The battle demonstrated that individual initiative and tactical judgment could overcome superior numbers and equipment when applied at the crucial moment with proper understanding of enemy capabilities and limitations. McCluskey's decision to ignore orders and continue his search had proven that sometimes the greatest act of service to one's country requires disobedience to specific orders that fail to account for rapidly changing battlefield realities. The victory at Midway marked the beginning of American strategic offensive in the Pacific, leading to a series of campaigns that systematically reduced Japanese defensive capabilities and brought the war steadily closer to the Japanese home islands. The transformation of Wade McCluskey from an unknown squadron commander to one of the most important figures in Pacific naval warfare illustrates the unpredictable nature of military leadership and the critical importance of individual decision-making in moments of national crisis. His background as the son of a railroad worker from Buffalo demonstrated that heroism and strategic insight are not limited to graduates of elite institutions or inheritors of military tradition, but can emerge from any background when circumstances demand extraordinary performance. The qualities that made McCluskey effective as a naval aviation commander, including his independence of thought, willingness to question conventional wisdom, and confidence in his own judgment, were the same characteristics that had occasionally created friction with superior officers earlier in his career. The Battle of Midway provided the perfect circumstances for these qualities to prove their value, as the rapidly changing tactical situation required improvisation and risk-taking that would have been inappropriate under normal operational conditions. His decision to extend the search beyond prescribed fuel limitations represented a calculated gamble based on professional expertise and tactical intuition rather than reckless disregard for established procedures. The success of his navigation and target acquisition under the enormous pressure of combat conditions vindicated years of training and experience while demonstrating the importance of trusting professional instincts when conventional approaches prove inadequate. The impact of his decision extended far beyond the immediate tactical results, as the victory at Midway enabled subsequent American offensive operations that systematically dismantled Japanese defensive positions throughout the Pacific. His example became a model for aggressive leadership that emphasized results over rigid compliance with procedures, though it also highlighted the enormous responsibility that accompanies such decision-making authority. The transformation of American naval aviation tactics following Midway incorporated many of the lessons learned from McCluskey's successful search and attack, including improved coordination between different types of aircraft and more flexible fuel management procedures that allowed for tactical adaptation to changing conditions. His post-war assignments included senior positions in naval aviation training and doctrine development, where his experience at Midway influenced the preparation of a new generation of naval aviators. The respect accorded to McCluskey by his peers and subordinates reflected not only his tactical success, but also his consistent demonstration of the leadership qualities that define effective military commanders in combat situations. In reflecting on Wade McCluskey's extraordinary act of heroism during the Battle of Midway, we must consider the profound implications of individual initiative and moral courage in moments when the fate of nations hangs in the balance. His decision to extend his search beyond safe operational limits transformed what appeared to be certain American defeat into the most decisive naval victory of the Pacific War, fundamentally altering the strategic balance between Japan and the United States. The courage he displayed was not the reckless bravado of a glory-seeking pilot, but the calculated risk-taking of a professional officer who understood that following orders blindly would result in mission failure and potentially catastrophic strategic consequences for his country. His story illustrates the essential tension between military discipline and tactical innovation, demonstrating that the most effective leaders are those who possess the judgment to know when established procedures must be abandoned in favor of aggressive action based on battlefield realities. The mathematical transformation of the Pacific War that began with his decision to continue searching for the Japanese fleet reminds us that history often turns on individual choices made by people who refuse to accept defeat, when victory remains possible through determined action. McCluskey never sought fame or public recognition for his actions at Midway, preferring to let his service record speak for itself while crediting the courage and skill of the pilots under his command. But his example continues to inspire military professionals who face similar moments of decision in their own careers. The tactical lessons learned from his success became foundational elements of American naval doctrine, proving that innovation and individual initiative must be encouraged even within the structured hierarchy of military command that necessarily emphasizes discipline and coordination. His willingness to risk everything on a navigational gamble that proved spectacularly correct demonstrates the importance of trusting professional expertise and tactical instincts when conventional wisdom fails to account for rapidly changing battlefield conditions. The hundreds of thousands of American lives that were ultimately saved by the victory at Midway can be traced directly to one man's decision to ignore fuel conservation orders and continue searching for an enemy fleet that conventional wisdom suggested had already escaped. The strategic consequences of that decision extended far beyond the immediate tactical results, enabling American offensive operations throughout the Pacific that eventually brought the war to a successful conclusion. His legacy challenges every military professional to consider whether they possess the moral courage and professional competence necessary to make similar decisions when faced with impossible choices and uncertain outcomes in defense of their nation and their comrades. Would you have possessed the courage to make that same decision, knowing that failure meant not only your own death, but potentially the collapse of American resistance in the Pacific and the invasion of your homeland by enemy forces? Would you have trusted your professional instincts enough to risk 32 aircraft and irreplaceable aircrew on a tactical gamble that defied every established rule of fuel conservation and operational safety? Comment below and share this story so others remember that sometimes the greatest victories in history require the courage to disobey orders that no longer serve the mission's ultimate purpose, and that individual heroism can change the course of entire wars when applied at the crucial moment with wisdom, skill, and unwavering determination.